Malibu Pocahontas. From my journal. Third grade, Mrs. Taylor's class. The assignment was to dress up as an important person and give a report about that person to the class. 2 sources. I got it in my head that I wanted to pick a Native American woman, and I considered Sacagawea. I chose politician Sharice Davids instead. June 29th. I don't remember ever not wanting to be a photographer. When I was 4 or 5 years old, Grandpa bought me a toy camera and I carried it like a baby blanket. By the time I turned 10, I was borrowing his Minolta. By age 12, I started scraping my money together to buy a 35mm of my own. For weeks, I scoured Shutterbug magazines for a good deal and pumped up my fund of allowance and birthday money by mowing lawns. At $250, the Nikon I chose was a steal, but the cost kept on coming. Printing paper, lenses, a flash. Grandpa helped out, showed me how to shoot, and let me use his darkroom. He taught me how to see like a real photographer. Details, texture, light, and shadows. When I walked into the examiner's darkroom, I couldn't help comparing it with Grandpa Berghoff's and mine in the attic. At home, black plastic sheeting covered the window to block out daylight. A red safe light hung over the 3 developing trays that rested on a sheet of plywood propped over the bathtub. The enlarger sat on the counter next to the sink, where we washed prints. Crowded, but homey. The musty dark room at the Hansberg Weekly Examiner was like a giant walk-in closet with a double sink. It had all the essentials, plus old photos of floods, fires, and fireworks. Chemicals had long stained the concrete floor. It was spacious, uncharted territory. Glorious. Grandpa always says a darkroom is like a magic cave. Low on light, smelly. A different adventure for every shooter, every time. A place of possibilities. Using filters, papers, and chemical mixes, the photographer can reproduce, rediscover, and reinvent realities. Most of my first roll had been shot before that afternoon. The Christmas lights I'd taken 6 months earlier after visiting the playground with Gallon and Shuey. I used fence posts, mailboxes, and car hoods to substitute for a tripod, and my filter had created starburst effects. My favorite showed off the shimmer of the giant wire flamingo strung with holiday lights on the mayor's front lawn. Along the way, I'd taken 4 shots of Gallon, just to tease him, calling him a supermodel. The moon hadn't been bright enough to make those pictures come out. Sure enough, those frames looked empty. Vacant. Negatives show scenes in reversed light. Mine showed too many snapshots and not enough pictures of the Indian campers at the park. At first, I jabbed the shutter release button instead of squeezing it, blurring the images. Halfway through, I realized power lines cluttered my shots, and the next 2 negatives, waving water from the in-ground sprinklers, appeared to spurt out of Marie's head and shoulders. In another frame, I decapitated Aunt Georgia. Nerves, I guess. After a few hours, I sloshed yet another blank sheet of paper in the developer and waited as the image slowly emerged. I imagined to shoot only one decent picture. The Indian campers all seemed in sync. Dimitri and Marie without their shoes, Spence blowing a bubble, Queenie with a regal braid, and Aunt Georgia with her backpack. The scene almost made me wish I wasn't addicted to black and white film. But Grandpa always says that true artists shoot the highlights and the shadows because stories live in shades of gray. He says color can hide the truth. Finally, I pulled the paper out of the developer, let it drip and drop into the fixer. It had taken 8 prints to get it right. After my final effort dried, I stepped out and let myself savor working in a real-life, old-school newsroom. The cheap wood paneling, the industrial tile, the agricultural calendar from the local insurance office. The place smelled like worn boots, stale cigarettes, and burning wax. Mrs. Burnham looked over from the ad she was designing to tell me Natalie had stepped out for a doctor's appointment. Mrs. Grubert snagged the phone at the front desk. The Flash hunched in front of a Mac, eating Oreo cookies the wrong way, like sandwiches. Any luck? I handed over the picture, telling myself I didn't care what he thought. I mean, how smart is a guy who wears a black trench coat in 80-plus degree weather? Marie had been right at the park. It sounded like an invitation to heat stroke. Studying the photo, the Flash said, "Not bad for little Miss Ask Permission." "You charmed Aunt Georgia," I said. "Like a snake," he replied. The Flash licked his fingers, crumpled his cookie wrapper, aimed for the trash can, and missed. But it was you she was glad to see. I wondered what all Natalie had told him about me. "Let's see," the Flash continued. "Spence lives in some place called Edmond, just outside of Oklahoma City. That leaves only 3 Native Americans actually from Hansberg. Wait, Do you know if the Hedberg's parents both live here in town? A painted hangnail had split from my right pinky. I flicked it with my thumb. What difference does it make? It's for the story, the Flash replied. You know, who, what, where, when, how, and why. Under the ever-popular category of who? Sounded more like how many to me. The preschool song about counting little Indians popped into my head. I always hated that song. I know of 9 Indians living in town, I said. They prefer Native Americans, the Flash told me. I shoved the tune out of my head and shifted my camera strap. He jotted down the number. I'll call Mrs. Wilhelm to double check. Excuse me? I asked. Look, I know you're from here, the Flash said, and everybody seems to know too much about each other in this creepy little town, but if Nat has to run a correction, she'll shish kebab me. Your future sister-in-law is my only professional wreck. Part of the deal with being me is that every now and then I feel like I have to announce my native heritage. What are you? People sometimes ask Finn. It sounds like they want him to ID his entire species. Because my color is lighter, I usually get the next standard questions. How much Indian are you? About 45 pounds worth. And are you legally, for card-carrying, Indian? Yes, but only on my mother's side. I don't mind as much when it's Native people asking, probably because they show respect for the tribal affiliation for my family. They never follow up with something like, you don't seem Indian to me. I've never asked the phrase, seem Indian, but I figure it involves construction paper feathers, a plastic paint pony, and Malibu Pocahontas. Right then, I missed Gallon even more than usual. He used to go everywhere with me. If I ever felt uncomfortable, he'd step up with a smooth thing to say, make a joke. Standing in the newsroom, I didn't feel ready to deal with someone new. I wanted to hightail it back home to Finn and Natalie to wait for Grandpa Berghoff to come home from Vegas. I wanted to do mindless, monotonous things like vacuum and dust. Look, I finally told the Flash, I should know how many Native people live in Hansburg. It's not that big of a town, and I'm one of them. Me, my brother, my uncle, Aunt Georgia, and the Hedbergs. Come to think of it, the Hedbergs moving to town had more than doubled our Native population. I've always been the only Native kid near my age who attended Hansburg Middle School, prayed at the First Baptist Church, and gobbled fries at the local McDonald's. Maybe that sounds lonely, and I guess in some ways it was, but I was used to it. And besides, it wasn't like I could have non-Native friends, at least. I used to. I glanced at the Flash. Some people size up me and my brother like we're the latest models in experimental genetics. Most normal, polite people at least, try to look like they aren't staring. Not the Flash. He was going for it, bug-eyed and proud. It struck me as funny. Ridiculous funny, not ha-ha funny, but my smile felt tight. I was still waiting for a question. The Flash shifted his gaze from me to his notes, twisted back around and keyed in a quote. He bit into another Oreo cookie, again like a sandwich. So much for my theories on human behavior. I decided to change the subject. I know it's not any of my business, I said, sitting in the corner of his desk, but is it true that you always carry tequila? The Flash reached into an inner pocket of his trench coat, pulled out a monogrammed silver flask, and set it on the desk. Want some? I picked it up, unscrewed the cap. Had this batch long? Ages, the Flash answered. Then his expression changed from know-it-all to caught red-handed. Why? Something about his questioning tone reminded me of the way Finn had reacted as a sophomore in college when I asked him why he'd been carrying the same condom in his wallet for 6 years. I sniffed the flask, and the smell of tequila burned the back of my throat. It's full, I said. Image, he explained, blushing, and emergencies. Finn had said pretty much the same thing. I thought about how Uncle Ed had tried to forget the Gulf War and ended up with 2 ex-wives to forget too. But Finn and Grandpa had a few beers every now and then, and they didn't seem worse off for it. I recapped the flask, not eager to find out what Finn might say if I came home with tequila breath. I was even less eager to hear one of Dad's lectures if he ever found out. Partly, I think, because of the grief it caused Uncle Ed. Dad never touches the stuff. Once last fall, I finished the half-empty beer Uncle Ed had left on my porch, mostly to impress Gallon. The end result? Grandpa grounded me for a month, and let's just say that Gallon had to throw away his shoes and socks. The Flash repocketed his flask and laughed. Shooter, he said. I was thinking it would be amazing to do a feature project on this Native American youth camp. I could do sidebars on Miss Wilhelm and the rice harvest, personality profiles on a couple of the kids. You're not doing anything else, are you? Finn had Natalie, Grandpa had Clementine. The house was spotless. Of course I wasn't doing anything else. I picked up the Oreo wrapper, dropped it in the trash can, and said I'd signed on for a one-day shoot, but in just a couple of minutes, my attitude had flip-flopped. I liked hanging out with somebody who wasn't being careful with me. My struggles at the shoot and in the darkroom faded. I told myself I could make Natalie proud and maintain my objectivity. The flash and I shook on it. Not spit shook, just shook. I hoped I wouldn't live to regret promising a favor to a moderately cute college boy wearing a nose ring. When I got home from the Examiner, I checked my phone. The only message said, Cassie Rain, this is Mrs. Owen, Gallen's mother. I have a few more questions to ask you about this Native American youth program. I'm sure you've learned more about it since we last spoke. Please return this call as soon as possible. Gallen's mother, she said, like I could forget. I deleted the message. After the evening news, I wandered back into the kitchen and noticed a postcard from Grandpa on the table. Unlucky in Las Vegas headlined a picture of a cracked slot machine. The other side read, Dear Rainbow, never met a woman so stubborn as that Clementine. She won't so much as let me pick up the check at dinner. All that sass, no wonder she's been married 6 times. Probably jabbered her husband to death. I've had enough. Going back downstairs for more Jell-O. XOXO, Grandpa. P.S. Lost the $440 I won on the slots. Natalie strolled past my open door, carrying 4 rolls of wallpaper. One had unfurled, and it trailed her like a bridal train. We do not have a wallpaper kind of house. We have a house with antique white walls and stenciled borders. Roosters in the kitchen, cherubs in the bath, pineapples in the dining nook, ivy in the family room and hallway. Turning into my parents' bedroom, I bumped into Natalie coming back out. She had apparently dropped off her supplies and was hauling out a load of clothes. As we collided, she dropped an armful of mostly jeans, sweatshirts, and sweaters. You're exactly what I need, Natalie told me. Another set of hands. Finn's been holed up in his domain all night. Natalie gathered up most of the pile, carried it back into my parents' bedroom, and tossed it onto the bed. I picked up the long denim skirt off the hardwood floor and followed her in. I realized then that the skirt was in my hand, the clothes she'd been carrying out, they belonged to my mother. I couldn't understand why Natalie had even been touching Mom's clothes. Glancing around, I couldn't believe what Natalie had done, either. Mom's ballerina jewelry box wasn't sitting on the dresser. Her collection of antique cats from pillbox to poke had been stripped from the brass rack. Her traditional tear dress was gone. Natalie tugged a Beacom Hawk sweatshirt onto its plastic hanger and hung it in the molding of Dad's well-stocked rifle cabinet. She touched the glass doors and then drew back. Do you think your dad would mind if we moved this thing into the basement? She asked, glancing at me. Rain? I stood in the middle of the room, still holding the denim skirt. Chewy lay in the doorway, nose on his front paws. The spinning ceiling fan offered little relief from the rising humidity. Finn didn't tell you, Natalie said. She sank to the edge of the bed and fiddled with her earring. When I talked to your dad the other day, she explained, we decided to convert the back porch into a room for him so Finn and I could move in here. What's wrong with Finn's room? I asked. You guys have seemed happy enough sleeping there since your 4th date. It had just slipped out. That happens sometimes. My mouth malfunctions. I wiped the sweat from the back of my neck. The previous month, Finn had ripped out the window unit air conditioner from our parents' bedroom and hooked it up in his domain to cool down his precious computer equipment. Never mind the discomfort to us humans or the dog. You need to talk to your brother, Natalie whispered. What does that mean? I wondered, staring at her worn face. She seemed so tired lately, so different, down to her meteor diet. The heat seemed to be getting to her even more than to me. Suddenly it all made sense. Natalie's shadowed eyes, the all-new pressed and buttoned-down Finn, their short, stressful engagement. Finn and Natalie were moving into my parents' room, so Finn's could become a nursery for their baby. Natalie was pregnant and had been for some time. Finn should have told me. I was family. Besides, Natalie would need me, and not just for diapering. I'd grown up in Hansburg, and I knew people already had to be talking about her being some spoiled Johnson County girl. And never mind that a quarter or so of the women in town were single mothers. In Hansburg, Natalie was still considered an outsider, and Finn was a hometown boy, one of the few with a future, who hadn't moved away. Lorelei, in particular, would be sure to broadcast her feelings on the subject. I blew out a long breath and told Natalie, No, my brother needs to talk to me.